China is one of the 21st century's most consequential nations. It has never been more important to understand how the country is governed and what its leaders and its people actually want and believe. Welcome to Pecology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system and the trajectory of China's domestic and foreign policy. I'm your host, Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. This is Pecology. I am very excited to be joined today by Jessica Batke, Senior Editor for Investigations at ChinaFile, as well as Laura Edelson, Assistant Professor in the Corey College of Computer Sciences at Northeastern University. They recently co-authored a report titled The Locknet: How China Controls Its Internet and Why It Matters. Understanding how the Chinese Communist Party thinks about and controls the flow of information is so critical to understanding the broader direction of Chinese politics. And of course, the party's management and censorship of the internet is a big part of that equation. So Jessica and Laura, it is great to see you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Great to see you.
So you two have very different but very complementary backgrounds. Of course, Jessica, you're a longtime sinologist and an expert on Chinese domestic policy, and Laura is an expert on the internet and social media. But I'd like to ask both of you, how did you become interested in researching China?
Wow. Okay, so this goes way back. I was a linguistics major in college, and you had to show proficiency in 2 foreign languages. And I had already tested out Spanish from high school and was taking Italian and was like, has nobody noticed that this is just the same language? And was feeling really, really cocky because I was 19. And I was like, I'm just going to take the hardest language. And I had no knowledge of China or previous interest in China at all. And then I took Chinese, and wow, they really tried to weed you out. Those classes were only at 7 and 8 a.m. I was late to that. And then I went to China for this first semester of my senior year in college. And it was just like, no looking back.
And Laura, what brought you to China work?
I, unlike Jessica, am very new to thinking about China and the Chinese internet, but I've been thinking about the security and safety of internet systems for a long time, and particularly social media, and trying to figure out how to understand security issues on social media platforms. And I came to a point a few years ago where I just came to think that I couldn't really understand those issues. I couldn't fully understand threat actors and what good secure systems would look like without really understanding state actors and without understanding China specifically much better than I did. And so when Jessica called me for this project, it was exactly the kind of opportunity I was looking for, and I dove in headfirst.
Great. Well, it's an incredible report. I very strongly recommend that our listeners take a deep dive into your research. But to start, the report actually begins with an anecdote from January of this year when something like 500,000 Americans suddenly joined Rednote, a China-based social media platform somewhat akin to Instagram, but not widely used by foreigners until January, when joining Rednote became a protest vote against a TikTok ban in the US. And so you paint this picture of Chinese and American social media users meeting each other and these beautiful moments of intercultural connection from the first few days. And then the party gets involved. Can you talk about what happened and what it tells us about the Chinese internet?
Yeah, so it only took a few days or a week. I don't remember exactly the timeline. At least this was what was reported. We were unable to get anyone at Rednote to talk to us about this, but the party basically called them and was like, you need to deal with this situation and maybe even keep foreign users from showing up for Chinese users or vice versa, basically creating little walled gardens within the app so that foreigners were mostly interacting with other foreigners and Chinese users were mostly interacting with other Chinese users. Anecdotally, it seems like that happened for some people and not for others. But again, we couldn't get anyone to talk to us about it. Laura, did you have anything to add?
I think what I find so interesting about this episode is how clearly it illustrates the different user expectations of people in China and people in the United States. This entire episode was motivated by large numbers of Western users who wanted to troll their own government. And the idea that you could do that in China, it's just not a thing you can do. It's not a thing you can do for so many reasons that you are taught from a very early age. And watching this clash of expectation play out on the internet, it really illustrates, I think, a lot of the things that we were trying to highlight in the report in microcosm, from those differing user expectations to the fact that there's like a lag in how long some of these technical systems take to be put into place, the bureaucracy that gets involved, and the fact that ultimately this wall goes up between, a domestic audience and an international audience. And it's imperfect. It's, somewhat permeable, but at the end of the day, it's actually pretty effective.
And it seems like American users had the experience of the Rednote algorithm changing almost in real time to wall them off from Chinese users, with an evolving censorship picture that I think was quite surprising to users less familiar with that environment. But agree, it seemed like a really memorable microcosm of a lot of the broader trends you described. And so to get into the party's management of the internet, you described 3 different levels of management comprising what you've called the Locknet. So there's the network level controls, which manage information coming in to China from abroad. There's service level controls in which the platforms themselves have responsibility for managing content produced and seen within China. And then thirdly, there's regulation and enforcement from the party and the state itself. So how does the party weave these tools into a coherent system of censorship?
I think something that people often forget about the internet is that it is a deeply physical system. We think about it as magic, and it's not. It is decades and decades of physical infrastructure and algorithms and ways of doing business and APIs all layered on top of one another. And APIs, application protocol interfaces, this is a term we use. They're a formal way for computer systems to talk to each other with a structured language. And so anytime 2 systems are talking to each other, they're probably doing it through an API. We like to think about all this stuff as magic because we don't have to interact with it. We just interact with our browser or our phone. But there's all of this stuff that has a real physical reality somewhere that was made by people who are subject to the jurisdiction of governments. And it's that ultimate physical control that honestly backs all 3 of these. So just starting with the physical layer, if you want to lay a cable, if you want to install a data center, all of these things, you're going to need permitting. It's very difficult to hide these things. They're not secrets. You need government permission to dig. And so what this means is that ultimately governments have a lot of power over how the physical infrastructure of their internet gets built. And China's government has used that power to make sure that it is built in a way that encodes control over the flow of information as a basic system requirement. So even on this physical infrastructure layer, this design requirement that we don't have in the global internet is baked into Chinese physical infrastructure. Next, service level censorship. So every company that operates inside China, whether it's a Chinese domestic company, whether it's a foreign company operating inside China, has to follow the laws of China. And again, this is true all around the world. Every company that operates has to follow the laws of the jurisdictions it is operating inside of. But in China, that means that if the government wants access to information, you're going to hand that over. And again, this is true in other countries. We just have different processes for how that happens. And there's also a big difference in how visible this exchange of information is to other sort of systems of society. And then finally, just as people in the United States are subject to the laws of the United States, people inside China are subject to the laws of China. And there are laws that say you can't say certain things. They just don't have freedom of speech in the way that we do. And what that means in practice, that's not an abstract concept. That means that in China, you'll get invited to tea. And these are just what the laws of this country are. It manifests in these different systems in all of these different ways, but it all comes back to that.
I just realized we never defined what the Locknet is. So I cannot take credit for this. This was Laura's brilliant term. We spent a lot of time trying to think about how do we describe this system, because the Great Firewall, while extremely evocative and funny, isn't actually a very accurate description of the system as a whole, right? A wall is static. It stops traffic just from going in or out. That's all it does. And this system isn't just about keeping foreign information out, although it does do that. It is also about cleaning and purifying the information that's inside, controlling flows of information that's inside. It's dynamic, it's adaptable, it can change, And so what we were thinking about was water locks. They can adjust the level in an artificial lake, even if there's, floods or storms or droughts. And so we were thinking about that when we were trying to describe how dynamic and adaptable the system is.
I'd love to go a little deeper on the platform level of censorship. And you say in the report, the platforms have a unique challenge. They must create actionable rules for their human employees and automated systems about topics that, from a political perspective, don't exist, which I think is a great tension to draw out. The platforms have to employ people to manage information on the internet, but those people are supposed to keep June 4th, Tiananmen off the internet and many, many, many other ideas, but without knowing themselves what those ideas are. How does that play out?
I'm so glad you brought this up. This is one of our favorite parts of this. We spent many hours discussing this. I guess favorite's the wrong word. That makes it sound like it's delightful. It's not in real life. But yeah, it was a really great interview that the Diaspora magazine Mang Mang had done with someone who works at, I believe they call it China's largest search engine, which I think we all know who that is, but they never name it in Mang Mang, so I won't name it either. And the person working there said that the way that they dealt with this was they would have like these PowerPoint presentations where someone would bring in a slide deck. You couldn't take any pictures or anything. And then they would be like, here's this evil cult, the Eastern Lightning cult, and here's some facts about it. And then they would just immediately take it off the screen and go away. And then that was it. And you were never supposed to remember it again. And the information control worker said, you get the feeling that they want you to learn it and then immediately forget it. And so it is this incredibly awkward mission that the services, the platforms have of we need our people to know enough to get rid of the bad information, but also we don't want them to know the bad information. And so in some ways, the machine learning and AI systems that are coming online will be helpful for this, but you're always going to need to have humans in the loop. And this is always going to be a problem for them.
And does that create gaps?
I don't know if gaps is the right way of putting it. I think this is an inherent problem of covert censorship. If you want to memory hole a fact, if you want to disappear it from existence, there's some period of time where you've been partially successful at doing that. And this is the situation that the Chinese government has gotten themselves into. They have been partially successful at memory holing certain facts like the Tiananmen Square massacre. And what that means is that, if they're going to continue to memory hole this event for their own people, they need some persistent source of knowledge of it. And, right now, the way they manage this is that there are a group of people who are allowed to know this thing, but aren't supposed to talk about it, kind of as Jessica described, to the degree that they can bake that knowledge into an algorithm or an AI system. That reduces the size of that group of people who need to know that thing, that secret knowledge. But I think it's going to be a persistent problem for as long as they are in this state of wanting to memory hole something, but not having succeeded in it. And it might just be a persistent problem, for as long as they choose to do this.
Yeah, because also they're constantly generating new things that need to be memory holed, right? The world keeps happening. Things keep happening. So it's not like there's a set of incidents which occurred long ago and recede ever further into the past. There's a continuing creation of new things that need to be censored.
It's a great point. And you highlight well in the report that if we're thinking about information control, there's removal and censorship, but that's only kind of half of the equation. There's also a part of this that's about information addition or promotion, or I think you said the formation of discourses, like an additive element of information control. What does that look like?
So we spent less time on this, as you know, as an avid reader of our article.
Avid, yes.
We spent less time on this than we did on the information subtraction side of the equation. We're actually hoping to spend a little bit more time in the future working together on the information addition side of the equation. So I will talk a little bit, Laura, first about like actual propaganda, and then you can get into the algorithmic stuff. But I think anybody who is familiar with China or has spent time looking at Chinese news media or propaganda, this is all going to be extremely familiar to you. This is run by the same sets of folks who do it elsewhere throughout the government and in other media. They're generating content, they're putting it online, they're asking companies to promote it. And, within regulations set forth by the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is the overarching internet governance body, they have illegal information, negative information. They called positive information. I'm not sure. But there's a third category of information that they actually want promoted. And that's like explicitly written into these rules for companies. And companies are aware that they're supposed to be promoting not just government created content, but user created content that follows along with these guidelines that promotes what the party wants promoted. You want to talk a bit about algorithms, Laura?
Yeah. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about information spaces. If you think about how information flows online and particularly on social media, there is a bit of a information market. There are things people want to know about, and there are things people want to tell other people about. And content feed algorithms are attempting to not necessarily meet all of that demand for information. They're just trying to maximize, well, frankly, the ad revenue of the platforms, that they serve. But very often, the way that they do that is by delivering people the content that they have a demand for. That's how you keep people on a platform. That's how you keep people engaged on a platform. So what's really interesting to me about feed algorithms and how they intersect with censorship is that if you simply don't ever recommend something in a content feed, it's a particularly covert kind of censorship because you can never really know, did something not get served up in a feed because it just wasn't engaging to people or because it was explicitly censored? The other interesting thing, though, about feed algorithms is not only is it a great way, potentially, of tamping down information you don't want covertly, it's also a way of elevating, as Jessica was describing it, positive information. And it's really important, I think, to do that other piece to promote the positive discourse, the positive narrative, because that demand for information will continue to exist. If there's like a big boom noise, people are going to open up their news feed to see, like, was it an earthquake? And so if you only tamp down on the bad information that you don't want, but you don't fill that void with anything else, you're left with unmet demand. And something will fill that space. And so these are sort of very general things we know. And I'm really looking forward to studying more how this plays out on Chinese social media.
And does the experience of censorship on the internet differ based on where you are in China?
Yes, it does. Much in the ways that you might expect it would. So we know for certain populations, like Uyghurs or other ethnic minorities, there might be more restrictions on them based on where they are. For example, if they're in the Uyghur region. A paper just came out, a computer science paper just came out as we were getting ready to publish this, showing that Henan province, very randomly, which is a province kind of eastish within China, and I don't think anybody would have picked that one out as one that should be extremely highly censored. They have their own provincial firewall that blocks like 10 times the amount of websites that the national firewall does, and there is not a definitive or great explanation for why this is occurring. So yes, it can totally depend on where you are, what happens. But I also wanted to just raise something that has to do with what Laura was talking about, which has to do with platforms. And I think one thing that it's really important to remember is that there's like an inherent tension for companies running services online in China, that the government strictures are constantly in tension with their commercial needs. And so while they want to keep the most interesting content alive and online to get as many eyeballs and clicks as possible, that often competes very intensely with their duties towards the government to remove things.
It's a great point. And there's so many interesting tensions, even within the party's own priorities for the information space that manifest in online. You highlight in the report, the experience of GitHub in 2013 being blocked, but then unblocked after there were a lot of concerns raised by the private sector about how that could affect the broader innovation ecosystem in China. And now, today, it's mostly not blocked, but sometimes is. And would love to get your thoughts on some of those tensions between the party's political ambitions for the internet and its economic and innovation ambitions for science and technology and the internet itself in China.
One thing just to say quickly about this, something I had not fully appreciated until I really started looking at these issues closely, is almost like the microclimate of censorship and the microclimates of interests. I was thinking about this, when Jessica was talking earlier about how what is censored isn't fixed. Every day there is a change in what is censored, and the body of forbidden knowledge does grow, but also there are all of these competing interests where, exactly as Jessica said, censorship very often cuts against companies' commercial interests, and they have to figure out how much censorship do I have to do to not get in trouble, and, how far can I push the bounds, because I have a profit motive on the other side, and that profit motive is very real. And I do think that there is absolutely an economic tension at play here because, it's expensive. There's an opportunity cost to all of this. I think one of the things that, again, I came away from this project much better understanding is that the party state is very, very willing to pay an economic price if they think that that's the price they need to pay for regime stability. They're very, very happy to do that. But to the extent that they don't have to do that, that they think they can have an economic gain and it's not going to cost them economic stability, they're also very happy to do that. I do think that they are always going to put the stability of the party state first. But anything after that, they're very happy for, Chinese workers to access GitHub, to, build businesses and build the Chinese economy, just as long as it doesn't, threaten state power.
And of course, the e-commerce world in China is incredibly vibrant, in many ways, much more innovative than what you would see in the US or in the open internet. So, I think would have surprised some watchers from Washington, earlier in the period of Chinese internet censorship, we might have expected a greater stifling of innovation, of online economic activity. And that hasn't, it's hard to measure the opportunity cost, but it seems to not be playing out as dramatically as some might have assumed.
Yeah, I think that, China has a massive advantage in that, you have a huge number of consumers. You also have a huge number of entrepreneurs and innovators just within the one market. So basically, they have such a massive wellspring of resources internally that they are able to generate all these amazing apps and do all of this stuff and have this really vibrant online ecosystem despite this drag, the censorship drag. And I don't think necessarily this would be as successful if China was a lot smaller with a lot fewer people, but you do have this massive dynamic market of people who want stuff and want to make stuff. And so even though you've drawn lines around them, they're still going to do a bunch of stuff within those lines.
I also think that there are spheres where there is a huge latitude of the kinds of things you're allowed to go out and try. And there are other areas where there's just not. There are red lines. There are areas where you are expected to not, widely explore and try anything you want. I think computer science has historically been, an area where there was lots of ability to experiment and try new things in an engineering and computer science space. And I think that kind of atmosphere of just try things has pervaded a lot of, you mentioned e-commerce, but, actually there's a tremendous amount of really cutting edge computer science that is being done in China. And the climate there is very open inside that space. And it's sometimes hard to think about that from our perspective, but it's absolutely true.
I'd love to talk about VPNs in that they seem to work sometimes. Why is that? You mentioned in the report there's a government-approved VPN that some enterprises can access. How should we think about the space that the CCP opens up to evade this system? Or is it part of the system itself?
Okay, so yes, there are government-approved VPNs because without them, people would not be able to do business externally, right? You've got all these companies that need to get, their Gmail and their Drive and all these other things. So those have to be available. But I don't like the idea that they're keeping a space open. I feel like that's an older idea generally that people had where well, we're allowing people to blow off steam. We want them to be able to say certain things. We want them to be able to get outside the fire. I think there was this misconception for a really long time that this was a very deliberate effort by the party to allow people access to this forbidden fruit of information. And I really, having studied the system, have come to think it's not so much a deliberate strategy to allow them, so much as a deliberate prioritization of goals and what they determine is most and least threatening. And so what you've seen in the VPN space is that, putting aside those approved ones, they've gone after the biggest kind of full suite, easy to download from the App Store VPNs. And there's a bunch of other tiny ones that are like sold on Taobao and you find out about on Telegram and stuff. And they're kind of churning constantly that still exist because they're just harder to track down. They're a lot more work, basically, but they also serve many, many fewer people. And so I would just encourage people not to think about this as we're intentionally leaving a door open for some citizens to get this information, so much as like we have decided that we have bigger fish to fry, and like the 20 dudes over there that are using this random VPN, we don't care enough about to make it worth our while.
And I think you highlight in the report an important element that you only need a bit of friction, actually, to control the kind of information that people are going to seek. I have to just quote this one line that you said, in reality, most Chinese internet users appear to thirst after the same things all of us do: TV shows, sports scores, and cat videos, ideally in our native tongues. So, this doesn't have to be a foolproof system to be quite effective. Laura, what would you add?
I think that last point you raised is absolutely the most important one. To control the information people have access to, you actually don't need that many barriers. Very often, small nudges will do the trick. But I think what makes looking at the VPN landscape and really understanding what's going on here so hard is I think there's a few different things that are going on. One is something, I think, Jessica, in the report, we called it the personalization of censorship. The Chinese government is okay with different rules for different people. And they can make a more effective, more dynamic system if they set up different rules for different people. There are some people who the party state just doesn't think of as being that much of a threat to the system. And it's okay giving those people more access to systems and to information because they trust what they're going to do with it. So I think some of what we see around particularly the official VPNs is a little bit of that, of ways of personalizing the effects of the Locknet to different audiences, because that's actually the most dynamic and effective way of building out that system. I think understanding this other market of illicit VPNs, the ones that you buy off of Taobao, I think about that more as something that they don't like, don't approve of, but just haven't prioritized, I should say, marshaling the resources to fully stamp out. And I think this is something that they would be very happy to see go away, but just haven't really put together the resources, haven't prioritized it. And I actually see this as one of the key weaknesses, of the Chinese government, is they're still a government. They're still this big bureaucracy. And if they have a weakness, it's that they move somewhat slowly, as any government does. And I think that's why you kind of see these illicit VPNs manifesting in the way that they do, which is, they sort of spring up like mushrooms. They use whatever works at the time they pop up, and, they go away and something else sprouts up tomorrow. Because I think that is a strategy that is actually really effective against a big government. It takes advantage of that inherent slowness.
And China's online censorship apparatus is increasingly shaping also the experience of the internet for users outside of China. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, so first of all, there's the things that we kind of discussed a little bit earlier about Rednote, right? So service level censorship is the most obvious example of how this spills out over into the rest of the internet, where if you have a platform you just have one platform that operates in China and outside of China, you haven't created two different versions, that platform will have to abide by China's censorship rules. And therefore, even if you're using it outside of China, you're going to be receiving censored content. So everybody that signed up for Rednote in January to thumb their nose at the US government was also receiving content censored by Beijing. Great job. There's other ways, though, that this happens. There's some accidental leakage that can happen, and this is more often the case for network level censorship. So that's the censorship that's kind of stopping data flowing over China's borders. And that just has to do with kind of like the vagaries of the system and the vagaries of internet routing. So one example is if someone in Malaysia is trying to send an email to someone in California, and the data packets from that email just so happen to cross over China's border, even though neither of the parties are in China, that email can be censored because China's systems will be inspecting it. So that's a way that the network level censorship system can leak out into the rest of the world.
So Jessica's talking about these platform effects, but these are really not the only way that this is happening. So all of that internet infrastructure that I was talking about before, all of that is built by a vast array of companies. And the reason that, all this different equipment can be built by different companies and all talk to each other is that they're all relying on a common set of internet standards that governs how information flows, how it's structured, and all the little decisions that get made about, where information goes and how it gets resent if it needs to be resent. All of that stuff is embedded in internet standards. And internet standards aren't a thing we did once 40 years ago and that they stayed fixed. We are always developing new internet standards to define, things like, how we're going to do the next generation, of mobile traffic. We all want better transmission of live events. We all want better emergency notifications. There's all sorts of ways that we need to make the internet work better for more people. And we're doing that through internet standards. And, Chinese companies serve a huge audience of internet users, a tremendous both portion of the world's population and portion of the world's internet users. So it's probably not very surprising that Chinese companies are trying to participate in global internet standard setting bodies. But they are coming with a different set of priors. They are subject to the laws of China. And so, again, they don't think about our global internet. They think about the Locknet. They think about an internet that does have this requirement for controlling the flow of information as a core design requirement. And so, when they show up at standards bodies, they are advocating for technological changes that would embed that design requirement. And I think this is where there really is a danger to the global internet community, because the way that happens technically, it can be really dry. It can be really boring. Like, oh, it's this field in this place in a data packet. But the reality is that making changes to internet standards that make it easier for them to transmit live events and easier to broadcast, disaster warnings, and also do that at the expense of privacy, that do that in a way that make them easier to surveil, easier, to disrupt the flow of information, to cut off freedom of speech. That's a genie that if it comes out, we cannot put back in the bottle. It would be very, very difficult to do so. And it would create an opportunity for any government that controlled a network that implemented that standard to execute at a much lower cost the kind of censorship and surveillance that China subjects its own citizens to.
That's as good a note as any to end on. Jessica and Laura, thank you so much for coming on the show. To learn more about the Chinese internet and how the CCP controls the flow of information, I really do hope you'll read their China-File report, The Locknet, How China Controls Its Internet and Why It Matters. To our listeners, we'd love to hear what you thought of the show and which guests you would like to see on Pecology in the future. You can send your ideas to pecology@csis.org, and we will be back in your feed in 2 weeks.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.